Hello? I'm Maya Chen. My parents told me I was selfish for wanting to keep my own inheritance, that I owed my sister everything because she'd had a harder life. They demanded I hand over the $850,000 my grandmother left me, insisted it was the right thing to do for family. But when I refused and they threatened to disown me, I decided to do some digging of my own. What I found wasn't just shocking, it completely flipped the script on who owed whom. Because sometimes the people who demand your generosity have been hiding their own debts, and sometimes the house they're threatening to kick you out of isn't even theirs to begin with. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The desert sunrise painted my Scottsdale apartment in shades of amber and rose, the kind of light that made everything look softer than it really was. I stood at my kitchen window, watching the palm trees sway in the early morning breeze, holding a cup of coffee that had already gone lukewarm while I'd been lost in thought. 6 months had passed since Grandma Elena's funeral. 6 months since the reading of her will had turned my world upside down in the most unexpected way possible. The inheritance had been a complete surprise. $850,000, plus her little craftsman house in Flagstaff that held decades of memories and the faint scent of her lavender soap. I'd never expected anything from Grandma Elena. She'd always been this quiet, independent woman who lived simply, grew her own vegetables, and saved every penny she earned from her decades working as a seamstress. Dad used to joke that she could stretch a dollar until it screamed, but there was admiration in his voice when he said it. She'd immigrated from Taiwan with nothing, built a life through sheer determination, and apparently had been quietly investing and saving for longer than any of us realized. The lawyer had explained that she'd specifically chosen me as her sole beneficiary, noting in a handwritten letter that I was the only grandchild who'd visited her regularly, who'd listened to her stories about the old country, who'd helped her with her English when she struggled with complicated forms or medical paperwork. My phone sat silent on the granite countertop, but I knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. For the past 2 weeks, ever since I'd finally told my family about the inheritance, the calls and texts had been relentless. Mom's voice would take on that particular tone she'd perfected over the years, the one that made you feel guilty for breathing wrong. Dad would clear his throat in that way that meant he was about to deliver what he considered wisdom, but usually amounted to pressure. And Jessica, my younger sister Jessica, would alternate between tears and rage, between pleading and accusations, like she was cycling through every emotional manipulation technique she'd ever learned. The inheritance had become this thing between us, this wedge that seemed to split our family down the middle. According to them, I was being selfish. According to them, Jessica needed the money more than I did. According to them, I owed her this chance because life had been harder for her, because she'd struggled more, because she deserved a fresh start. They painted me as the successful one, the one who'd always had it easier, the one who didn't need help because I'd managed to build a decent life for myself. They conveniently forgot that I'd worked 2 jobs through college, that I'd graduated with honors while Jessica partied her way through 3 different universities without ever finishing a degree. They forgot that I'd been the one to help with Grandma Elena's medical bills when she'd gotten sick, that I'd been the one to visit her every weekend during her final months while Jessica had been too busy with her latest boyfriend drama. But families have selective memories, especially when money is involved. And $850,000 was enough money to make people forget a lot of inconvenient truths. I set my coffee cup down and walked to my small home office, a converted bedroom where I'd been working remotely since the pandemic changed everything. My marketing job at a tech startup wasn't glamorous, but it was stable, and I'd been proud of the life I'd built for myself. The apartment was small but clean, furnished with pieces I'd saved up for and chosen carefully. Everything had its place. Everything made sense. Unlike my family, where nothing seemed to make sense anymore. The inheritance documents sat in a manila folder on my desk, along with the deed to Grandma Elena's house and copies of all the legal paperwork. I'd read through everything multiple times, still amazed that this quiet woman who'd served us tea in delicate cups and told stories about her childhood in Taiwan had accumulated so much wealth. The house alone was worth nearly $200,000, nestled in a quiet neighborhood in Flagstaff where property values had been steadily climbing. The financial portfolio was even more impressive. Stocks, bonds, savings accounts, all meticulously managed and documented. I'd been planning to use the money responsibly, pay off my student loans, maybe put a down payment on a house of my own, invest the rest for my future. It wasn't flashy or exciting, but it felt right. It felt like honoring Grandma Elena's memory by being as careful and thoughtful with the money as she'd been in earning it. But according to my family, that made me selfish. According to them, I should hand it all over to Jessica so she could finally get her life together, maybe go back to school, maybe start the business she'd been talking about for years but never quite managed to launch. The irony wasn't lost on me that Jessica had never visited Grandma Elena unless it was a major holiday, had never learned more than a few words of Mandarin despite Grandma's attempts to teach us both, had never shown much interest in our heritage or our grandmother's stories. But now she was devastated by the loss. Now she was talking about how much Grandma Elena meant to her. Now she was suggesting that surely Grandma would have wanted the money to help the granddaughter who needed it most. My laptop chimed with a new email notification pulling me back to the present. Work emails mostly, but mixed in was another message from Mom with the subject line, "Please call me." I'd been avoiding their calls for 3 days now, ever since our last conversation had ended with Dad telling me I was disappointing the family and Mom saying that Grandma Elena would be ashamed of my selfishness. The words had hit harder than I'd expected, even though I knew they were trying to manipulate me. Knowing someone is manipulating you doesn't always make it hurt less. Phoenix was starting to heat up for the day, the temperature already climbing toward what would probably be another scorching afternoon. I'd grown up here, was used to the desert heat, but lately it felt more oppressive than usual. Everything felt more oppressive than usual. The weight of family expectations, the guilt they kept piling on, the constant pressure to do what they considered the right thing, it was exhausting. I walked back to the kitchen and poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, adding cream and sugar. The way Grandma Elena had taught me she liked it. She'd always said that life was bitter enough without making your coffee bitter too. It was such a simple philosophy, but it felt profound in a way that most simple things do. She'd lived through so much: poverty, immigration, discrimination, the death of her husband when my dad was still young. But she'd always found ways to add sweetness to the bitter moments. Maybe that's why she'd left me the inheritance. Not because I was her favorite, but because she'd recognized something in me that reminded her of herself. The willingness to work hard, to save for the future, to find sweetness even when things got difficult. I wanted to believe that anyway. I wanted to believe that her decision had been about more than just who visited most often or who helped with paperwork. I wanted to believe that she'd seen something in me worth investing in. My phone buzzed against the counter, and I glanced down to see Jessica's name on the screen. For a moment, I considered letting it go to voicemail like I had with the others. But something made me pick up. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was hope that this conversation would be different. Maybe it was just the caffeine finally kicking in. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Maya? Jessica's voice was thick with tears, the way it had been for most of our recent conversations. Please don't hang up on me. I leaned against the counter, watching a roadrunner dart across the courtyard outside my window. I'm here. I know you're mad at me, at all of us, but I really need to talk to you. Not about the money, not directly, just about us, about family. She paused, and I could hear her taking a shaky breath. I miss you, Maya. I miss how things used to be between us. The thing was, I missed that too. Jessica and I had been close when we were younger, before life got complicated, before she'd started making choices that worried everyone, before the family dynamics had shifted into this weird hierarchy where I was expected to be the responsible one, and she was allowed to be the one who needed rescuing. I missed the sister who used to sneak into my room after nightmares, who used to help me braid friendship bracelets, who used to laugh at my terrible jokes and make up elaborate games for us to play in the backyard. I miss that too, I admitted, and I could hear her relief in the little sob she tried to muffle. Can we meet? Just for coffee? I promise I won't ambush you or bring mom and dad or anything like that. I just want to talk to my sister. Her voice got smaller. I feel like I'm losing you, and I can't stand it. Looking back, I should have been more suspicious of the timing, of the way she phrased things, of the careful vulnerability in her voice. But I loved my sister, despite everything, and the idea of repairing our relationship felt more important than protecting myself from whatever manipulation might be coming. Family has a way of making you forget your own best interests, especially when they know exactly which emotional buttons to push. Okay, I said finally, but somewhere neutral. And Jessica, I mean it. I don't want this to turn into another argument about the inheritance. Of course not, she said quickly. Thank you, Maya. Thank you so much. How about Cornerstone Cafe on Camelback? Around 2 this afternoon? I agreed, and after we hung up, I found myself staring out the window again, watching the desert landscape shimmer in the rising heat. Maybe this would be the conversation that helped us find our way back to each other. Maybe Jessica really did just want to repair our relationship. Maybe I was being too cynical, too defensive, too quick to assume the worst. The morning passed slowly as I tried to focus on work, responding to emails and reviewing marketing campaigns for our latest product launch. But my mind kept drifting to the conversation ahead, to all the things I wanted to say to Jessica about how much our relationship meant to me, about how I wished things could go back to the way they used to be. I found myself remembering the good times, the way she used to defend me when kids at school teased me about being too studious, the way we used to stay up late talking about our dreams and fears, the way she used to make me laugh until my sides hurt. By 1:30, I was sitting in my car in the cafe parking lot, air conditioning blasting against the afternoon heat, trying to calm the nervous energy that had been building all morning. Cornerstone Cafe was busy with the lunch crowd, the kind of place with mismatched furniture and local art on the walls, the kind of place where conversations happened over fair trade coffee and organic pastries. It felt safe, public enough that we couldn't get too emotional, casual enough that we could hopefully just be sisters again. I spotted Jessica as soon as I walked in, sitting at a corner table with her back to the wall, already nursing what looked like an iced latte. She'd always been beautiful, the kind of effortless beauty that made people do double takes, but today she looked tired, her usually perfect makeup slightly smudged, her long dark hair pulled back in a messy bun instead of the careful waves she usually preferred. She looked up when she saw me approaching, and her smile was genuine, the first genuinely happy expression I'd seen from her in weeks. "You came?" she said, standing up to hug me. And for a moment, it felt like we were just sisters again. Just two people who loved each other despite everything complicated between us. We talked about small things at first. Her job search, my work, the ridiculous heat, a movie we'd both watched recently. It felt good, normal in a way that our conversations hadn't felt in months. Jessica had always been charming when she wanted to be. Funny and warm and engaging, and I found myself relaxing in spite of my earlier wariness. Maybe she really had just wanted to reconnect. Maybe I'd been overthinking everything. But then, about 20 minutes into our conversation, something shifted. Jessica's expression grew more serious, more vulnerable, and she leaned forward across the small table. "Maya, I know I promised we wouldn't talk about the inheritance, but I need you to understand something." Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. I'm not asking for the money because I'm greedy or because I think I deserve it more than you do. I'm asking because I'm drowning." I felt my stomach tighten, but I tried to keep my expression neutral. "What do you mean?" "Tyler and I were in trouble. Real trouble." She glanced around the cafe as if checking to make sure no one was listening. "We owe money, Maya. A lot of money. More than you know." The Tyler she was referring to was her boyfriend of 8 months, a guy with a charming smile and ambitious plans that never quite seemed to materialize. I'd met him a few times at family gatherings, and while he was pleasant enough, something about him had always struck me as slightly off, too smooth, too quick with explanations that didn't quite add up. "What kind of trouble?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Jessica's eyes filled with tears again, but these looked different from the manipulative tears I'd grown accustomed to. These looked real, frightened. Tyler had this business opportunity, this investment thing that was supposed to be guaranteed, returns. He convinced me to put in some money I didn't really have, and then he kept saying we needed to invest more to see the real profits. She wiped her eyes with a napkin. "It was a scam, Maya. The whole thing was a scam, and now we owe people money that we don't have." I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cafe's air conditioning. "How much money?" $60,000. The number came out as barely a whisper. "Maybe more, depending on interest and fees. These aren't the kind of people you can just ignore, Maya. They've been calling, showing up at Tyler's apartment. Yesterday, someone left a note under my car windshield with my work address on it." The story spilled out in fragments. How Tyler had met someone who claimed to be a successful day trader. How they'd started with small investments that had shown modest returns. How they'd been encouraged to invest larger and larger amounts with promises of exponential profits. By the time they'd realized it was a pyramid scheme designed to separate them from their money, they were already in deep, having borrowed against credit cards and taken out loans to fund what they thought would be their ticket to financial freedom. "The worst part is I can't even blame Tyler entirely," Jessica continued, her voice shaking. "I was so desperate to prove that I could be successful, that I could make something of myself, that I ignored all the red flags. I wanted so badly to show Mom and Dad that I wasn't the family screw-up that I convinced myself this was my chance." I sat there listening, feeling the weight of her words, trying to process the implications. This wasn't just about wanting to start fresh or go back to school. This was about safety, about people who might actually hurt her if she couldn't pay them back. The sister I'd grown up with, the one who used to be afraid of horror movies and wouldn't even kill spiders, was mixed up with people who left threatening notes and made intimidating phone calls. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" I asked. "Why didn't you just explain the situation instead of making it about deserving the inheritance?" Jessica looked down at her hands, her voice becoming even smaller. "Because Mom and Dad said you'd never give me the money if you knew it was for something like this. They said you'd think I was irresponsible, and that I deserved whatever happened to me for being stupid enough to fall for a scam." She looked back up at me, her eyes desperate. "But Maya, I'm scared. I'm really scared, and I don't know what else to do." The manipulation was more subtle this time, wrapped in genuine fear and vulnerability, but I could still feel it. The way she'd positioned Mom and Dad as having predicted my response. The way she'd made it seem like not helping would mean I thought she deserved to be hurt. The way she'd waited until I was emotionally invested in repairing our relationship before dropping this bombshell. It was more sophisticated than her usual approaches, but it was still manipulation. And yet, underneath all of that, I could see that her fear was real. Whatever mistakes she'd made, whatever poor choices had led her to this point, she was genuinely terrified. And she was still my sister. "Jessica," I said carefully, "even if I wanted to help you, giving you $850,000 to pay off $60,000 in debt doesn't make sense. That's like using a fire hose to water a houseplant." "I know," she said quickly. I know it's not all for the debt. But Maya, this could be my chance to really start over. Pay off what we owe, maybe go back to school, get my life together. With that kind of money, I could finally become the person I've always wanted to be. There it was, the real ask. Not just help with the immediate crisis, but funding for a complete life overhaul. A guarantee that she'd never have to face consequences for her choices again. It was bigger than the debt, bigger than Tyler's scam, bigger than any specific problem. It was a request for me to solve her entire life with Grandma Elena's money. I need to think about this, I said finally, because I didn't know what else to say. The situation was more complicated than I'd realized, but that didn't necessarily change my answer. It just made the decision harder. Jessica reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Thank you for listening. Thank you for not just walking away. She paused. And Maya? Whatever you decide, I understand. I know I've made mistakes, and I know it's not your responsibility to fix them. I just needed you to know the truth. We hugged goodbye in the parking lot, and as I drove home through the blazing Phoenix afternoon, I felt more confused than ever. Part of me wanted to help her, wanted to be the kind of sister who would do anything to protect family. But another part of me wondered if helping Jessica with this crisis would just enable her to make bigger mistakes in the future, if giving her access to that much money would actually make her problems worse instead of better. That evening, I called in sick to work the next day and spent the night walking around my apartment, trying to think clearly about the situation. I pulled out the inheritance documents again, looking at Grandma Elena's careful handwriting on the letter she'd left explaining her decision. She'd specifically mentioned that she hoped I would use the money wisely, that she trusted my judgment, that she believed I understood the value of hard work and careful planning. Would giving the money to Jessica honor those wishes? Or betray them? By morning, I still didn't have an answer, but I had a plan for how to find one. The alarm on my phone buzzed at 6:30, the same time it had every morning for the past 3 years. I reached over and silenced it before it could disturb the quiet that had settled over my apartment like a comfortable blanket. Through the blinds, I could see the first hints of dawn creeping across the Arizona sky, painting the mountains in the distance with soft shades of pink and gold. This was my favorite time of day, before Phoenix woke up and filled itself with traffic and noise and the relentless energy of people rushing toward their daily obligations. I padded barefoot across the cool tile floor to the kitchen, where my coffee maker was already programmed to start brewing. The smell of French roast filled the small space, mixing with the faint scent of the lavender candle I'd lit the night before and forgotten to blow out. Everything in my apartment had its place, from the stack of marketing journals on the side table to the succulent plants lined up on the windowsill, each one thriving in the desert light that streamed through the glass. I'd worked hard to create this space, this life that felt stable and predictable and entirely my own. The morning routine was something I'd perfected over years of living alone. Coffee first, then a quick scan of the news on my phone while I waited for my brain to fully engage with the world. I'd check my work emails, but only the urgent ones, saving the rest for after I'd had time to properly wake up. Then I'd do 20 minutes of yoga on the mat I kept rolled up beside my dresser, stretching out the tension from another night of sleeping curled up like a question mark, the way I'd slept since childhood. Today felt different, though. The conversation with Jessica yesterday had left me unsettled, her words echoing in my head even after a restless night of turning over her revelations. $60,000 in debt to dangerous people. Tyler's get-rich-quick scheme that had exploded in their faces. The fear in her voice when she talked about threatening notes and intimidating phone calls. It was like discovering that the sister I thought I knew had been living a completely different life, one filled with risks and poor decisions that I couldn't have imagined. I poured coffee into my favorite mug, a handmade ceramic piece I'd bought from a local artist at a farmer's market. The glaze was slightly uneven, imperfect in a way that made it feel more real than the mass-produced options at department stores. I wrapped my hands around it, feeling the warmth seep through my palms, and tried to center myself the way my yoga instructor was always encouraging us to do. Ground yourself in the present moment. Feel your feet on the earth. Breathe into the space between your thoughts. But the space between my thoughts was crowded this morning, filled with questions I didn't know how to answer. How long had Jessica been in trouble? How much of her recent behavior had been driven by fear rather than simple entitlement? And more troubling, how much did my parents know about the real situation? Their insistence that I give Jessica the inheritance had felt manipulative from the beginning. But if they knew she was in actual danger, did that change the moral calculation? I carried my coffee to the small balcony that overlooked the courtyard, settling into the patio chair I'd rescued from a neighbor who was moving out. The desert air was still cool enough to be pleasant, though I knew that by noon it would be scorching. A roadrunner darted between the Palo Verde trees, quick and efficient in its morning hunt for insects. I envied its clarity of purpose, the way it moved through the world without second-guessing every decision. My phone buzzed with a text from my boss, asking if I could join an early conference call with a client on the East Coast. I responded that I'd be ready in 30 minutes, then went inside to get dressed for another day of working from home. The pandemic had changed so many things about how we lived and worked, but I'd discovered that I actually preferred the solitude, the ability to structure my own day without the distractions of office politics and unnecessary meetings. I chose a blouse that looked professional on camera but was comfortable enough for a full day of sitting at my desk. My home office was tucked into what had originally been designed as a dining nook, with a view of the courtyard and enough space for my computer, a small bookshelf, and the file cabinet where I kept important documents, including now the inheritance paperwork that had turned my family upside down. The client call went smoothly, discussing social media strategies for a wellness brand that was launching a new line of supplements. It was the kind of work I'd grown good at over the years, understanding how to translate business goals into marketing messages that would resonate with specific audiences. I found satisfaction in the puzzle of it, the way you had to consider demographics and psychology and cultural trends all at once to create something that would cut through the noise and actually reach people. After the call, I made another cup of coffee and settled in to tackle the project proposals that were due by the end of the week. The work required focus, the kind of deep concentration that usually came easily to me, but today my mind kept drifting back to Jessica's revelation. The sister who had once been my closest confidant was living with threats and fear, and I hadn't even known. It made me wonder what else I might have missed. What other important details had been hidden behind the family dynamics that had shaped our adult relationships? Around 11, I took a break to water my plants and check the mail. And the desert. Heat was already building, the kind of dry intensity that could be brutal, but also strangely cleansing. I'd grown up with this climate, understood its rhythms and demands, knew how to move through it without fighting it. Phoenix was a city built on adaptation, on learning to thrive in conditions that seemed hostile to human life, and maybe that had shaped my personality more than I realized. The mailbox contained the usual mix of bills and advertisements, but tucked between a credit card offer and a grocery store circular was an envelope that made my stomach drop. First National Bank, printed in crisp blue letters across expensive-looking paper. I tore it open, standing right there in the courtyard, not wanting to carry the suspense back to my apartment. The letter was brief and official, informing me that there had been an inquiry about my credit report, specifically related to a large financial transaction. It suggested that I contact their fraud prevention department if I hadn't initiated any recent applications for loans or credit. My hands were suddenly shaky as I read it again, trying to understand what it might mean. I hadn't applied for anything. I hadn't even been considering any major purchases or financial changes beyond what to do with the inheritance. Back in my apartment, I immediately called the number listed on the letter. After navigating through an automated system that seemed designed to discourage actual human contact, I finally reached a customer service representative named Marcus Williams, whose voice carried the careful neutrality of someone who dealt with financial problems all day long. "Ms. Chen," he said after I'd explained why I was calling, "I show here that we received an inquiry yesterday about pre-approval for a home loan in the amount of $400,000. The application was submitted online using your personal information." My mouth went dry. I didn't submit any application. I haven't even been looking at houses. There was a pause, the sound of typing in the background. "The application shows your name, social security number, and current address. It also lists your employment information and references a recent inheritance as collateral for the loan." More typing. "I'm required to ask this, ma'am, but is it possible that someone in your family might have submitted this application on your behalf? Sometimes relatives will begin the pre-approval process as a surprise or as part of financial planning." The word family hit me like a physical blow. Someone had used my inheritance as collateral for a loan application. Someone who knew the exact details of my financial situation, my employment, my address. Someone who had access to my personal information and felt entitled to use it without my permission. "No," I said, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. "No one has my permission to apply for anything using my information. This is fraud." Marcus Williams walked me through the process of filing a fraud report, explaining that the bank would freeze any further activity on the application and launch an investigation. He also recommended that I contact the credit reporting agencies to place alerts on my accounts and monitor for any other suspicious activity. The conversation took nearly an hour, and by the time I hung up, my comfortable morning routine felt like something from another lifetime. I sat at my kitchen table with the fraud report paperwork spread out in front of me, trying to process what had just happened. Someone had attempted to use my identity to secure a $400,000 loan, using the inheritance as collateral. The timing couldn't be coincidental, coming just weeks after my family had learned about Grandma Elena's gift. The question was who had done it and how they'd obtained all my personal information. The more I thought about it, the more obvious the answer became. My family had access to most of my personal details through years of shared documents and emergency contacts. They knew about my job, my address, my social security number from tax documents and insurance forms. They knew about the inheritance because I'd told them about it myself, wanting to be transparent about this major change in my financial situation. But knowing that someone in my family had likely committed fraud against me was different from proving it. The bank's investigation would take time, and in the meantime, I was left with the horrible suspicion that the people who were supposed to love and protect me were the same people who were willing to steal my identity for their own purposes. I spent the rest of the afternoon trying to focus on work, but my concentration was shot. Every time my phone rang, I jumped, wondering if it would be another bank or credit agency with news of additional fraudulent applications. Every email notification made my heart race, imagining more evidence of financial crimes committed in my name. The sense of safety and control I'd built around my life felt suddenly fragile, like it could be dismantled by people who knew exactly which foundations to attack. That evening, I drove to the grocery store to pick up supplies for dinner, but found myself wandering the aisles without really seeing what was on the shelves. The fluorescent lights felt too bright, the background music too cheerful for my mood. I ended up buying ingredients for pasta with marinara sauce, the kind of simple comfort food that had gotten me through difficult times before. Cooking had always been meditative for me, a way to create something nourishing and beautiful from basic components. Back home, I chopped vegetables with more force than necessary, letting the rhythm of the knife against the cutting board work out some of the anger and fear that had been building all day. The smell of garlic and onion sautéing in olive oil began to fill the kitchen, familiar and soothing. I opened a bottle of red wine and poured myself a glass, then another, trying to ease the tension that had settled in my shoulders like concrete. As the pasta boiled, I found myself thinking about Grandma Elena, about the careful way she'd managed her finances throughout her life. She'd lived through the Great Depression as a child, had understood what it meant to lose everything and have to start over. Maybe that's why she'd been so careful with money, so deliberate about her investments and savings. She'd wanted to create security that couldn't be taken away by external circumstances or other people's poor decisions. Now, someone was trying to take away the security she'd given me, using my own identity as a weapon against me. The violation felt personal in a way that went beyond simple theft. It was an attack on the trust I'd placed in my family, on the assumption that we would protect each other rather than exploit each other's vulnerabilities. After dinner, I sat on my couch with my laptop, researching identity theft and financial fraud. The articles I found were both informative and terrifying, describing cases where family members had destroyed each other's credit, stolen inheritances, and manipulated financial institutions using intimate knowledge of their victims' personal information. It was apparently more common than I'd realized. This particular form of betrayal that combined financial crime with emotional abuse. One article mentioned that financial fraud within families often escalated over time, starting with small, unauthorized transactions and building to larger crimes as the perpetrators became more confident and desperate. It suggested that victims should document everything, save all communications, and be prepared for the possibility that legal action might be necessary to protect themselves from further harm. I closed the laptop and finished my wine, staring out at the Phoenix skyline as the sun set behind the mountains. The city lights were beginning to twinkle in the gathering darkness. Thousands of people settling into their evening routines, most of them probably not questioning whether their own families might be plotting to steal their identities. I envied them their assumptions about trust and safety. My phone buzzed with a text from Mom, asking if I'd thought any more about Jessica's situation, and reminding me that family was supposed to take care of each other. The timing felt deliberate, coming on the same day I discovered someone had fraudulently applied for a loan in my name. I stared at the message for a long time before deciding not to respond. If Mom was involved in the loan application, responding might tip her off that I'd discovered it. If she wasn't involved, then she was still pressuring me to give away my inheritance without knowing the full situation. Either way, I needed more information before I decided how to handle any of this. I needed to understand who was behind the fraudulent loan application, what other financial crimes might have been committed in my name, and how deep this conspiracy might go. I needed to protect myself and my inheritance from people who apparently saw both as resources to be exploited rather than respected. Part 3. The Life-Altering Discovery. The next morning brought another call from First National Bank, this time from a different department with an even more serious tone. I was still in my pajamas, having overslept after a restless night of anxiety dreams, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Something about unknown numbers had started making me nervous, as if every call might bring news of another financial crime committed in my name. Ms. Chen, this is Detective Rodriguez with the Fraud Investigation Unit at First National Bank. The woman's voice was crisp and professional. I'm calling about the loan application we discussed yesterday with my colleague Marcus Williams. We've uncovered some additional information that requires immediate attention. I sank into a kitchen chair, my coffee growing cold in my hands. What kind of additional information? Our investigation has revealed that the fraudulent application wasn't an isolated incident. We've found evidence of multiple attempts to access your account information over the past 6 weeks, as well as inquiries about your inheritance funds from various financial institutions. She paused, and I could hear papers rustling in the background. Ms. Chen, someone has been conducting what appears to be a systematic investigation of your financial situation. The room seemed to tilt around me. 6 weeks. That would put the timeline right around when I'd first told my family about the inheritance, when I'd naively thought that sharing good news would bring us closer together rather than make me a target for exploitation. How many institutions? I managed to ask. We've confirmed contact with at least 4 different banks and 2 investment firms. The caller claimed to be you in some cases, and in others claimed to be representing you as a family member with power of attorney. Detective Rodriguez's voice became more serious. Ms. Chen, I need to ask you directly. Have you given anyone in your family permission to act on your behalf financially? No, I said immediately. Absolutely not. I haven't signed any power of attorney documents or authorized anyone to access my accounts. In that case, what we're looking at is a coordinated effort to commit financial fraud on a significant scale. This isn't someone making a single mistake or testing the waters. This is someone who has been methodically researching how to access your inheritance money, and they've been doing it for weeks. The implications hit me like a series of physical blows. Someone hadn't just impulsively tried to apply for a loan in my name. They'd been planning this, researching it, contacting multiple institutions to find the most vulnerable point of attack. They'd been studying my financial situation with the kind of attention to detail that suggested they were serious about stealing as much money as possible. Detective Rodriguez continued, "We're going to need you to come in and sign some additional documentation for our investigation. We're also going to recommend that you contact an attorney because at this point we're looking at potential criminal charges for identity theft, fraud, and possibly conspiracy if multiple people are involved." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen for a long time, staring at my reflection in the window. The face looking back at me seemed different somehow, older and more wary, like someone who'd learned too much about the world in too short a time. The comfortable morning routine I'd perfected over years suddenly felt naive, a luxury that belonged to someone who still believed she was safe from the people who were supposed to love her. I called in sick to work again, knowing that I needed time to process this and figure out my next steps. My boss was understanding, though I could hear the concern in her voice when I explained that I was dealing with a family emergency. That phrase felt both accurate and inadequate. It was certainly an emergency, but calling it a family emergency made it sound like someone was in the hospital rather than someone in my family potentially being a criminal. The drive to the bank felt surreal, like I was moving through someone else's life. Phoenix traffic was its usual combination of aggressive and slow, people rushing to get to jobs and appointments while simultaneously stuck in the kind of gridlock that made rushing pointless. I found myself studying the faces in other cars, wondering if any of them were dealing with betrayal from their own families, if any of them had discovered that the people they trusted most were the ones most willing to hurt them. First National Bank's fraud department was located in a modern office building downtown, all glass and steel that reflected the desert sun in ways that made you squint even with sunglasses. Detective Rodriguez turned out to be a woman in her 40s with graying hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen too much human deception to be surprised by anything. She led me to a small conference room with institutional carpet and fluorescent lighting that made everything look slightly green. "Before we begin," she said, settling across from me with a thick file folder, "I want you to understand that what we've uncovered goes beyond simple fraud. The level of personal information that was used in these applications suggests that whoever did this has intimate access to your life. They knew details that would only be available to someone very close to you." She opened the folder and spread out several documents. Phone records showing calls to various financial institutions, all made from numbers registered to people with my last name. Email transcripts where someone claiming to be me had requested information about transferring large sums of money. Applications for lines of credit that used not only my social security number and employment information, but also personal details like my grandmother's maiden name and the street I'd grown up on. The person or people doing this aren't strangers, who somehow got hold of your identity, Detective Rodriguez continued. They're using information that would only be known by family members or very close friends, information that would be shared in casual conversation or family gatherings. I stared at the documents, seeing my life laid out like evidence in a crime scene. Everything from my first pet's name to my mother's maiden name had been weaponized. against me. Details I'd shared thoughtlessly over family dinners, security questions I'd answered while setting up accounts, personal history that I'd never imagined could be used to steal my identity. We've also discovered that inquiries were made about the specific terms of your grandmother's will, Detective Rodriguez said, sliding another document toward me. Someone contacted the probate court and the attorney who handled the estate, claiming to be researching the inheritance for tax purposes. That detail hit me harder than the others. Whoever was doing this hadn't just been trying to steal my money. They'd been researching the inheritance itself, trying to understand exactly how much was involved and how it could be accessed. They'd been treating Grandma Elena's final gift to me like a business opportunity, something to be analyzed and exploited rather than respected. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice coming out smaller than I intended. "Now we build a case. We track down every fraudulent contact, document every attempt to access your information, and work with law enforcement to identify the perpetrators." She leaned forward slightly. "Ms. Chen, I need to prepare you for the possibility that this investigation could lead to criminal charges against people you know well. Are you prepared for that possibility?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure I really was prepared. The idea of my own family members being arrested for financial crimes felt surreal, like something that happened to other people in news stories rather than something that could happen to me. But the evidence was right there in front of me. Documented proof that someone who knew me intimately had been systematically working to steal my inheritance. "There's one more thing," Detective Rodriguez said, pulling out a final document. "We found evidence that inquiries were made about your parents' property as well. Specifically, someone was researching whether their house could be used as collateral for loans taken out in your name." I felt the blood drain from my face. My parents' house, the one where I'd grown up, where family dinners still happened. Every Sunday, where Mom still kept my old bedroom exactly the way it had been when I'd moved out for college. Someone had been researching using it as collateral for stealing my money. Who would have access to information about my parents' house? I asked, though I was afraid I already knew the answer. Someone who lived there or had extensive knowledge of the property? Someone who would know details about the mortgage, the property value, the legal ownership. Detective Rodriguez's expression was sympathetic but firm. "Ms. Chen, I think it's time to consider the possibility that this conspiracy involves multiple members of your family." The drive home was a blur of Phoenix traffic and racing thoughts. I kept replaying Detective Rodriguez's words, trying to make sense of the scope of what had been attempted. This wasn't just Jessica trying to get access to money for her debt problems. This was a coordinated effort involving multiple people, detailed research, and plans that extended to using my parents' house as collateral. The level of planning and coordination suggested something much more serious than desperation or poor judgment. Back in my apartment, I poured myself a large glass of wine, even though it was barely past noon. I needed something to take the edge, off the anxiety that was making my hands shake and my heart race. The inheritance document sat on my desk like evidence of my own naivety. I'd been so focused on whether I should share the money with Jessica that I'd never considered the possibility that someone might try to take it without my permission. I called my friend Alex Kim, who worked as a paralegal at a law firm that handled white-collar crimes. We'd known each other since college, and I trusted her judgment about legal matters. When I explained what I'd discovered, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Maya," she said finally, "you need a criminal defense attorney. Not because you've done anything wrong, but because this sounds like a case that's going to involve law enforcement, and you need someone protecting your interests throughout the investigation." Criminal defense? The phrase made everything feel more real and more terrifying. "Alex, these are my family members we're talking about. My parents, my sister. I can't imagine any of them actually going to jail over this." "That's exactly why you need an attorney," Alex said gently. "Because your emotions are involved, and emotions make it hard to make good decisions about legal strategy. Someone tried to steal hundreds of thousands of dollars from you, Maya. That's serious felony territory, regardless of whether the person doing it is related to you. She recommended Sarah Thompson, an attorney who specialized in financial crimes and family-related fraud. I called and left a message, explaining briefly that I needed consultation about identity theft and financial fraud committed by family members. Sarah's assistant called back within an hour to schedule an emergency consultation for that afternoon. Sarah Thompson's office was in an upscale part of Scottsdale, in a building with marble floors and the kind of expensive artwork that suggested her services weren't cheap. Sarah herself was a woman in her 50s with silver hair and the kind of confident bearing that made you feel like she could handle whatever problems you brought to her. She listened to my story without interrupting, taking notes in precise handwriting while I explained about the inheritance, the loan applications, and the bank's investigation. Ms. Chen, she said when I finished, what you're describing is a pattern of behavior that suggests your family has been planning this for some time. The level of coordination and research involved indicates that multiple people were working together to access your inheritance. She explained that financial fraud within families was often more complex than other types of identity theft because the perpetrators had intimate knowledge of their victims and access to personal information that would be difficult for strangers to obtain. She also explained that family-related financial crimes often escalated over time, starting with small, unauthorized transactions and building to larger theft attempts. The fact that they researched your parents' property suggests they were planning to use multiple forms of collateral to maximize the amount they could steal. Sarah continued, "This wasn't a crime of opportunity or desperation. This was a calculated attempt to systematically drain your inheritance." She recommended that I take immediate steps to protect my remaining assets, including moving the inheritance money to new accounts that no family members knew about, and placing security freezes on all my credit reports. She also suggested that I minimize contact with my family until the investigation was complete, since anything I said to them could potentially be used to further their fraud attempts. But what if they're not all involved? I asked. What if only one person is doing this and the others don't know? Sarah's expression was sympathetic but realistic. That's possible. But given the scope of the research and the number of institutions that were contacted, it's unlikely that this was a one-person operation. And even if some family members aren't directly involved in the fraud, they may still be working to manipulate you into giving up your inheritance voluntarily. That evening, I sat in my apartment with a notebook, trying to make sense of everything I'd learned. I wrote down every family interaction I could remember since learning about the inheritance, looking for clues about who might have had access to my personal information and who might have been coordinating the fraud attempts. The patterns that emerged were disturbing but clear. Mom had been asking detailed questions about my finances, ostensibly out of concern, but with a level of specificity that had seemed odd at the time. Dad had made several comments about my bank and investment accounts, information he shouldn't have had unless he'd been researching them. Jessica had been emotional and manipulative, but her desperation might have been real if she'd known that a larger plan was in motion to access my money. The more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that this had been a family conspiracy from the beginning. The pressure to give Jessica the inheritance voluntarily might have been the preferred plan, but they'd been preparing backup options in case I refused to cooperate. They'd been treating my grandmother's gift like a family resource to be exploited, rather than my personal inheritance to be respected. As I prepared for bed that night, I realized that my comfortable, predictable life had been permanently altered. The sense of safety and trust that had allowed me to share personal information freely with family members was gone, replaced by a wariness that would probably never fully disappear. The people who were supposed to protect me had instead been plotting to rob me, and that betrayal had changed something fundamental about how I understood my place in the world. Tomorrow, I would have to start the process of rebuilding my financial security and deciding how to handle the relationships that had been damaged by this discovery. But tonight, I just sat with the weight of everything I'd learned, mourning the loss of the family I'd thought I had, and trying to prepare myself for whatever revelations might still be coming. Part 4. The Initial Investigation. I woke up the next morning with the kind of clarity that sometimes comes after a night of processing traumatic information. The shock and disbelief had settled into something more focused, a determination to understand exactly what had been done to me and who was responsible. I made coffee with steady hands and sat down at my laptop to begin what I now understood would be a methodical investigation into my own family's crimes. Sarah Thompson had given me a list of steps to take to protect myself and gather evidence. The first was to request copies of my credit reports from all 3 major agencies, looking for any accounts or inquiries I didn't recognize. The second was to contact every financial institution I'd ever used to alert them about potential fraud, and request detailed records of any recent inquiries about my accounts. The process was tedious and infuriating. Each phone call required explaining the situation to customer service representatives who seemed trained to be skeptical of fraud claims, then being transferred to fraud departments, then explaining everything, again to investigators who asked increasingly personal questions to verify my identity. The irony wasn't lost on me that proving I was myself had become so complicated because someone else had been pretending to be me. By noon, I had confirmation of attempted fraudulent access at 6 different financial institutions. Someone had called claiming to be me, asking about account balances, transfer procedures, and loan pre-approval processes. In 2 cases, they'd successfully obtained preliminary approval for loans that would have required my inheritance as collateral. If I hadn't caught the fraud early, hundreds of thousands of dollars could have been stolen before I even knew it was happening. The credit reports revealed additional disturbing information. There had been multiple inquiries about my credit score and history over the past month, all from institutions I'd never contacted. Someone had been shopping around, comparing loan options and credit limits, treating my financial identity like a resource to be maximized rather than protected. I printed out every document, every phone record, every piece of evidence I could gather. The stack of papers grew throughout the afternoon, a physical representation of the scope of the betrayal I was uncovering. Each new piece of evidence made the conspiracy feel more real and more extensive. Around 3 p.m, I decided to take a more direct approach to gathering information. I called my parents' house, knowing that Mom would be home from her part-time job at the dental office where she worked as a receptionist. When she answered, her voice was bright and cheerful, the same tone she'd used my entire childhood when she was trying to manipulate me into doing something I didn't want to do. "Maya, sweetheart, I'm so glad you called. I was just thinking about you and hoping you'd reconsider Jessica's situation." She paused, and I could hear the television in the background, probably one of the afternoon talk shows she'd been watching for years. "You know, your father and I have been talking, and we really think this could be a wonderful opportunity for you to show how much you care about family." I gripped the phone tighter, reminding myself to stay calm and focused on gathering information rather than confronting her directly. "Not yet." "Mom, I've been thinking about it too, but I'm confused about some of the financial details. Can you help me understand exactly how much Jessica owes and to whom?" There was a brief pause, just long enough to be suspicious. "Oh, honey, you know I'm not good with numbers. That's more your father's area. But I know it's substantial, and these people she owes money to aren't the kind of people you want to keep waiting." "What kind of people?" I pressed. "Are we talking about banks or credit cards or something else?" Another pause. "Well, some of it is official debt, but some of it is more personal. You know how these investment things work. Sometimes you owe money to individuals rather than institutions." Her voice became more urgent. "Maya, that's why this is so important. Banks you can negotiate with. but individual investors can be much more aggressive about collecting what they're owed. The way she phrased it made my skin crawl. She was describing Jessica's debt like she had intimate knowledge of the details, like she'd been involved in the conversations about repayment and consequences. This wasn't a mother expressing general concern about her daughter's welfare. This was someone who understood the specific mechanics of the debt and the specific risks involved in not paying it back. "Mom, has anyone in the family been helping?" "Jessica research solutions to this problem?" I asked, trying to keep my voice neutral. "I mean, has anyone been looking into loan options or other ways to get the money she needs?" "Oh, well, of course, we've all been trying to help, however. We can," she said quickly. "You know how it is when family is in trouble. Everyone pitches in with ideas and research." She paused again. "Actually, your father has been looking into some options. He's always been good with financial planning, and he's been researching what might be available." There it was. Dad had been doing financial research related to Jessica's debt. The same time period when multiple banks had been contacted by someone claiming to represent me. Someone who knew intimate details about my personal and financial history. The timeline was too convenient to be coincidental. "What kind of options has Dad been researching?" I asked. "Oh, loans and credit lines and that sort of thing. He's been trying to understand what might be available if Jessica had better collateral or a cosigner." Mom's voice was getting more nervous, like she was realizing she might be saying too much. "But Maya, none of that matters if you decide to help her directly. That would be so much simpler for everyone." After I hung up, I sat staring at the phone for a long time. Mom had essentially confirmed that Dad had been researching loans and credit options during the exact time period when fraudulent inquiries had been made in my name. She'd also confirmed that they had detailed knowledge of Jessica's debt situation, knowledge that suggested ongoing involvement rather than passive concern. I decided to call Jessica directly. If this was a family conspiracy, she might be the weakest link, the one most likely to reveal information she wasn't supposed to share. When she answered, her voice sounded tired and stressed, like someone who'd been carrying a heavy burden for too long. "Maya, I'm so glad you called. I've been hoping we could talk more about everything." She paused, and I could hear traffic in the background, like she was in a car or walking down a busy street. "I know yesterday was a lot to process, and I know it's not fair to ask you to solve my problems." "Jessica, I've been thinking about what you told me, and I want to help if I can," I said, using a tone that I hoped sounded supportive rather than investigative. "But I need to understand more about the timeline. When exactly did you and Tyler realize you were in trouble with this investment scam?" "It's been building for weeks," she said, her voice becoming smaller. "We started realizing something was wrong about a month ago, when the promised returns didn't materialize, and the person we'd been working with stopped responding to our messages." She took a shaky breath. "But we didn't want to admit to ourselves that we'd been scammed. We kept thinking maybe it was just a delay, maybe the money would still come through." A month ago. That put the timeline right around when the fraudulent inquiries about my accounts had started. Jessica and Tyler had realized they were in financial trouble, and somehow that had triggered a coordinated effort to access my inheritance. "Have you talked to Mom and Dad about the specific details of what happened?" I asked. "Do they understand how the scam worked and how much money is involved?" "Oh, yes. I had to tell them everything," Jessica said quickly. "I was so scared and ashamed, and I needed their help figuring out what to do. Dad has been amazing, actually. He's been researching options and trying to understand what legal recourse we might have." "What kind of options has he been researching?" "Well, he's been looking into whether we could get loans to cover what we owe while we try to recover the money through legal channels. He's been calling banks and talking to financial advisors about what might be available." Jessica's voice carried a note of admiration that made my stomach turn. "You know how Dad is with research. He's been so thorough. asking about different types of collateral and cosigners and all that complicated stuff I don't really understand. The pieces were falling into place with horrifying clarity. Dad hadn't been researching loan options for Jessica and Tyler. He'd been researching how to access my inheritance by using my identity and personal information. The fraudulent loan applications, the multiple bank contacts, the inquiries about my credit, it had all been part of his thorough research into solving Jessica's debt problem with my money. Jessica, when you say Dad has been calling banks, do you know which ones specifically? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Oh, I don't know all the details. First National, I think, and some others. He said he was trying to understand all the options before presenting them to us. She paused. Why? Is that important? First National Bank. The same institution where Detective Rodriguez was investigating fraudulent loan applications made in my name. Dad had been calling them, claiming to research options for Jessica, while simultaneously someone had been applying for loans using my identity and inheritance as collateral. Jessica, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to be completely honest with me. I took a deep breath. Has anyone in the family discussed applying for loans or accessing credit using my name or my inheritance? There was a long silence. When Jessica finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. What do you mean? I mean exactly what I said. Has anyone suggested using my identity or my inheritance to get loans or credit that would help with your debt situation? Another long pause. I could hear her breathing becoming more rapid, like she was having a panic attack. Maya, I don't understand why you would ask something like that. Because someone has been applying for loans in my name using my personal information and my inheritance as collateral, I said, my voice becoming harder. Someone who knows intimate details about my life, my job, my financial situation. Someone who would have access to information that only family members would know. Oh my God, Jessica whispered. Oh my God, Maya, I had no idea. I swear to you? I had no idea that's what he was doing. The confession hit me like a physical blow. She knew. Maybe she hadn't known the specific details, but she knew that Dad had been doing something with my information. Something that she now realized was criminal. What did you think he was doing, Jessica? I asked, my voice deadly calm. He said he was researching whether you might be willing to co-sign for something, or whether there might be ways to use your inheritance as a guarantee that you'd help us if we couldn't pay back a loan ourselves. Her words came out in a rush, like she was trying to get them out before she lost her nerve. He said it was just preliminary research, that he wasn't actually applying for anything, just trying to understand what options might be available if you agreed to help. And you believed that? I wanted to believe it, she said, and now she was crying. Maya, I was so scared, and I felt so stupid for falling for Tyler's investment scam. When Dad said he might have found a way to solve everything, I didn't ask too many questions because I didn't want to know if it was something I should feel guilty about. The willful ignorance was almost as infuriating as the outright deception. Jessica had known that Dad was doing something questionable with my information, but she'd chosen not to investigate further because she'd wanted to benefit from whatever solution he might find. She'd been complicit through deliberate blindness, allowing herself to be a victim of one crime while enabling another crime to be committed against me. Jessica, I need you to tell me everything you know about what Dad has been doing, I said. Every conversation, every detail, every piece of information you have about his research. Over the next hour, Jessica painted a picture of a family conspiracy that was both more extensive and more casual than I'd imagined. Dad had been treating my identity like a family resource, researching ways to access my inheritance as if it belonged to all of us, rather than specifically to me. Mom had been supportive of his efforts, viewing them as creative problem-solving, rather than criminal fraud. Jessica had been willfully ignorant of the details, but she'd known enough to understand that Dad's research involved using my information in ways I hadn't authorized. The most disturbing revelation was that they'd been planning this for weeks, ever since Jessica had first realized the extent of her debt. The pressure for me to voluntarily give her the inheritance had been their preferred solution, but Dad had been developing backup plans in case I refused to cooperate. He'd been systematically gathering information about my accounts, my credit, my employment, and my inheritance, treating it like reconnaissance for a military operation. Maya, I know this sounds terrible, but we never thought of it as stealing from you, Jessica said, her voice pleading. Dad kept saying that family money should be used to help family, that Grandma Elena would have wanted her inheritance to help solve family problems. We convinced ourselves that we were just being creative about accessing money that would eventually benefit everyone. Eventually benefit everyone? I repeated, my voice incredulous. Jessica, this is my inheritance. It was left specifically to me, not to the family in general. And even if it was family money, that wouldn't give you the right to commit identity theft and fraud to access it. I know, she whispered. I know that now. But when you're desperate and scared, you start rationalizing things that you know are wrong. And Dad can be very convincing when he wants to be. He made it sound like we were just being resourceful, like we were thinking outside the box to solve a problem. After I hung up with Jessica, I sat in my apartment feeling a mixture of rage and grief that was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. My father had been systematically researching how to steal my inheritance, using his knowledge of my personal information to commit crimes in my name. My mother had been supportive of his efforts, viewing financial fraud as acceptable if it benefited her favorite child. My sister had been willfully ignorant of the specific crimes being committed, but she'd known enough to understand that something unethical was happening and had chosen to benefit from it rather than stop it. This wasn't a case of one family member making a desperate mistake. This was a coordinated effort involving multiple people, all of whom had decided that my inheritance was a family resource to be exploited rather than my personal property to be respected. They'd been treating me like a means to an end, a source of money to solve Jessica's problems rather than a person with rights and autonomy. I called Detective Rodriguez to update her on what I'd learned from my conversations with Mom and Jessica. She listened without interrupting, occasionally asking for clarification about specific details or timelines. When I finished, there was a long pause. Ms. Chen, what you've described confirms our worst fears about this case, she said finally. This wasn't opportunistic fraud. This was a premeditated conspiracy involving multiple family members, with your father apparently serving as the primary researcher and coordinator. She explained that the evidence I'd gathered through my phone conversations would be crucial for building a criminal case. Jessica's admission that she'd known Dad was using my information for unauthorized research, combined with Mom's confirmation that Dad had been researching loan options, created a clear picture of conspiracy and intent. We're going to need you to continue documenting everything, Detective Rodriguez continued. Every conversation, every interaction, every piece of information you can gather about what they've been doing and how long they've been planning it. The more evidence we have, the stronger the case will be. She also warned me that the investigation was likely to get more intense and more personal as it progressed. Family members might realize that their crimes were being discovered and could become desperate or aggressive in their attempts to avoid consequences. She recommended that I limit contact with my family to documented communications that could be used as evidence, and that I consider changing my living situation if I felt unsafe. That evening, I called Sarah Thompson to update her on what I'd learned and to discuss next steps. She was particularly interested in Jessica's admission that she'd known Dad was using my information without authorization, viewing it as potential evidence of conspiracy that could be used to prosecute multiple family members. The fact that your sister knew something inappropriate was happening but chose not to investigate or report it makes her complicit in the fraud, Sarah explained. Willful ignorance isn't a defense when you're benefiting from criminal activity. If she knew your father was doing something questionable with your information, and she chose to remain silent because she hoped to benefit from the results, that's conspiracy. Sarah also recommended that I take immediate steps to protect myself from further fraud attempts. This included moving my inheritance money to new accounts at institutions my family didn't know about, placing security freezes on all my credit reports, and changing all my passwords and security questions to information my family wouldn't know. We also need to consider the possibility that they have physical access to documents or information that could be used for additional fraud attempts, Sarah continued. Do your parents have keys to your apartment? Do they have access to mail? Or documents that contain personal information? Have you left any financial documents at their house? The questions made me realize how vulnerable I'd been without even knowing it. My parents had a key to my apartment that I'd given them years. I go for emergencies. I'd left various documents at their house over the years: tax returns, insurance forms, bank statements, thinking of it as convenient storage rather than a security risk. They had access to decades of my personal information, accumulated through years of family interactions and shared documents. You need to change your locks immediately, Sarah said. And you need to assume that any personal information you've ever shared with your family could potentially be used against you. This means changing passwords, updating security questions, and possibly even changing banks if they have too much information about your current accounts. That night, I went through my apartment room by room, looking for any documents or information that could be used to commit additional fraud. I found old tax returns in a filing cabinet, bank statements in a desk drawer, insurance documents in a folder by my computer. Information that had seemed harmless when I was living a normal life suddenly felt like weapons that could be used against me. I spent hours shredding documents and changing passwords, trying to secure my life against people who already knew too much about me. Every security question I'd ever answered, my first pet's name, the street I grew up on, my mother's maiden name, had to be changed because my family knew all the real answers. Every password had to be updated because I'd made the mistake of using personal information that family members would know. The process was exhausting and depressing, like trying to rebuild my identity from scratch while simultaneously protecting it from people who'd helped create it in the first place. Every security measure I took was a reminder of how much trust had been violated. How many assumptions about family loyalty had been destroyed by my discovery of their crimes. As I prepared for bed, I realized that I was no longer the person I'd been a week ago. The trusting daughter who'd shared good news about her inheritance with family had been replaced by someone who had to treat her own parents and sister as potential criminals. The comfortable life I'd built, with its predictable routines and sense of security, had been permanently altered by the discovery that the people who were supposed to protect me had instead been plotting to rob me. Tomorrow, I would have to continue the investigation and work with law enforcement to build a criminal case against my own family. But tonight, I mourned the loss of the family I'd thought I had and tried to prepare myself for whatever additional betrayals the investigation might reveal. Our Part 4, the initial investigation. The locksmith arrived at 8 in the morning, an efficient woman in coveralls who changed the locks on my apartment without asking questions about why a young professional might need to secure her home against her own family. As I watched her work, I felt the surreal nature of my situation settle over me like a weight. Normal people didn't have to change their locks to protect themselves from their parents. Normal people didn't have to treat family dinners like potential crime scenes. But my family had stopped being normal the moment they'd decided that my inheritance was their solution to Jessica's problems. After the locksmith left, I spent the morning organizing the evidence I'd gathered into a comprehensive file that would be useful for both the bank's investigation and any potential criminal prosecution. Phone records, bank documents, credit reports, notes from my conversations with family members. Everything was dated, labeled, and organized into chronological order that told the story of how my family had systematically planned to steal my inheritance. The pattern that emerged was even more disturbing than I'd initially realized. The fraudulent activities had started within days of my first conversation with Mom about the inheritance. Someone had immediately begun researching my financial situation, as if they'd been waiting for an opportunity like this. The careful, methodical nature of their research suggested that this hadn't been an impulsive decision born of desperation, but a calculated effort to exploit a family member for financial gain. Around noon, I decided to visit Grandma Elena's house in Flagstaff. I hadn't been there since the funeral 6 months ago, and I needed to see the property that was now part of my inheritance. More importantly, I wanted to search for any documents or information that might help me understand why she'd chosen to leave everything to me, rather than distributing it among multiple family members. The drive to Flagstaff took me through some of Arizona's most beautiful desert landscape, but I was too distracted to appreciate the scenery. My mind kept replaying conversations with my family, looking for clues I'd missed, signs that should have warned me about their intentions. Had Dad's questions about my job and my bank seemed unusually detailed? Had Mom's concerns about my financial planning been more than maternal interest? Had Jessica's emotional manipulation been covering for knowledge of a larger conspiracy? Grandma Elena's house sat on a quiet street lined with mature trees, a modest craftsman-style home that had been meticulously maintained throughout her decades of ownership. The key was still hidden in the fake rock by the front door, a security measure that had seemed charmingly old-fashioned when I was growing up, but now felt dangerously naive in a world where family members committed crimes against each other. Inside, the house still smelled faintly of lavender and old books, familiar scents that brought back memories of childhood visits and weekend conversations. Grandma Elena had been a meticulous record keeper, and her home office contained filing, cabinets full of organized documents dating back decades. If there were answers to be found about her intentions with the inheritance, they would be here. I started with the most recent files, looking for anything related to estate planning or family communications. What I found was a manila folder, labeled Maya, that contained copies of every letter I'd ever written to Grandma Elena, every card I'd sent for birthdays and holidays, and every photo I'd given her over the years. The contents painted a picture of a relationship that had been more important to both of us than I'd fully realized. But more revealing were the documents I found in a folder labeled Family Concerns. These were notes Grandma Elena had made over the years about various family members, observations about behavior and character that read like a psychological profile. Her handwriting was careful and precise, documenting instances where family members had asked her for money, situations where she'd felt pressured or manipulated, and her growing concerns about the financial responsibility of some of her relatives. One note, dated 2 years ago, was particularly illuminating. Robert asked again about advance on inheritance, third time this year. Seems to view my savings as family money rather than my personal property. Concerning attitude about entitlement. Another note from around the same time. Linda mentioned that Jessica needs help with school expenses, suggested I could assist. When I explained I'd already helped with previous expenses, Linda became argumentative. Pressure tactics familiar from Robert's approaches. Grandma Elena had been documenting my parents' attempts to access her money for years. She'd seen through their manipulation tactics and had been keeping careful records of their behavior. The inheritance hadn't been an arbitrary decision. It had been a deliberate choice to protect her life savings from family members she'd identified as financially irresponsible and manipulative. I found additional notes about Jessica. Jessica visits only when she needs something. No genuine interest in family history or personal relationships. Requests for money becoming more frequent and larger. And about me. Maya visits regularly, without agenda. Listens to stories, helps with practical matters, shows genuine interest in family heritage, demonstrates financial responsibility and respect for others' property. The picture that emerged was of a woman who'd spent years quietly, observing her family's behavior and making careful judgments about who could be trusted with the wealth she'd accumulated. She'd chosen me not because I was her favorite, but because I was the only family member who'd consistently demonstrated respect for her autonomy and financial responsibility with money. But the most shocking discovery was a letter she'd written, but never sent, dated just 3 months before her death. It was addressed to my parents and was clearly a draft of a confrontation she'd been considering about their financial behavior. "Robert and Linda," the letter began. "I am writing to express my concern about the repeated requests for advances on inheritance money and the pressure you have applied regarding my financial decisions. Over the past several years, you have approached me multiple times asking for money for various family expenses, and when I have declined or set limits, you have used guilt and manipulation to try to change my mind." The letter went on to document specific instances where my parents had pressured her for money, including times when they'd brought Jessica along to make emotional appeals about her education and living expenses. Grandma Elena had seen through all of it, had understood that they viewed her as a financial resource rather than a person deserving of respect and autonomy. "I have decided to leave my estate to Maya," the letter continued. "Not because I love her more than other family members, but because she is the only one who has never asked me for money, never pressured me about my financial decisions, and never made me feel like my value to the family was dependent on my willingness to provide financial support." The unsent letter was devastating evidence of how my family had treated Grandma Elena during her final years. They hadn't just decided to steal from me after learning about the inheritance. They'd been pressuring an elderly woman for money while she was still alive, treating her like a bank rather than a beloved family member. I spent the rest of the Yapri afternoon going through more of Grandma Elena's documents, finding additional evidence of my family's financial manipulation and her growing awareness of their behavior. By the time I locked up the house and began the drive back to Phoenix, I had a much clearer understanding of why the inheritance had been left to me and why my family had felt entitled to take it away. That evening, I called Detective Rodriguez to share what I'd discovered at Grandma Elena's house. The unsent letter was particularly significant, as it provided evidence of a pattern of financial manipulation that predated the current fraud case. It showed that my parents had been treating family members as financial resources for years, and that Grandma Elena had been aware of their behavior. "This changes the scope of what we're investigating," Detective Rodriguez explained. "What we initially thought was fraud related to your inheritance may actually be part of a larger pattern of financial abuse targeting elderly family members. Your grandmother's notes could be evidence of elder financial abuse, which is a serious felony." She explained that elder financial abuse cases were often complex and difficult to prosecute because the abuse typically happened gradually over time and involved people the victim trusted. But Grandma Elena's meticulous documentation provided the kind of evidence that was usually missing in these cases. "We're going to need to expand our investigation to include your grandmother's financial records from the past several years," Detective Rodriguez continued. "If your parents were pressuring her for money and manipulating her financial decisions, there may be evidence of unauthorized transactions or coerced financial gifts that could support additional criminal charges." The idea that my parents might have been financially abusing Grandma Elena while she was alive was almost too horrible to process. I thought they were simply being greedy about my inheritance, but the evidence suggested something much darker. A systematic pattern of targeting vulnerable family members for financial exploitation. I called Sarah Thompson to update her on what I'd found and to discuss the implications for our legal strategy. She was particularly interested in the unsent letter, viewing it as powerful evidence of my family's character and their history of financial manipulation. "This letter transforms your case from simple inheritance fraud to something much more serious," Sarah explained. "It provides context for your family's behavior and demonstrates that their actions toward you are part of a larger pattern of financial abuse. A jury would find this evidence very compelling in establishing motive and character." She also explained that the discovery of elder financial abuse could lead to additional civil remedies beyond the criminal prosecution. If my parents had coerced Grandma Elena into giving them money or had manipulated her financial decisions, I might be able to recover those funds as part of the estate. The bottom line is that your family's crimes may be much more extensive than we initially realized, Sarah continued. And the evidence you've found today suggests that they've been engaged in financial manipulation and abuse for years, not just since learning about your inheritance. That night, I sat in my apartment reading through copies of Grandma Elena's notes, feeling a mixture of sadness and anger that was overwhelming in its intensity. My parents hadn't just betrayed me. They'd spent years manipulating and pressuring an elderly woman for money, treating her final years like an opportunity for financial exploitation rather than a time to provide love and support. The woman I'd known as a kind, generous grandmother had actually been documenting abuse, carefully recording instances of manipulation and pressure tactics, because she'd understood that her own family was exploiting her. She'd been alone in her awareness of their behavior, protecting herself through documentation because she couldn't trust the people who were supposed to care for her. And now those same people had targeted me, using the same manipulation tactics and sense of entitlement that they'd used against Grandma Elena. The inheritance fraud wasn't an isolated incident. It was the continuation of a pattern of financial abuse that had been going on for years. As I prepared for bed, I realized that the investigation was revealing not just crimes against me, but a history of crimes against other family members. The people I'd trusted and loved had been predators, systematically targeting vulnerable relatives for financial exploitation. And I was now in a position to either expose their crimes and seek justice, or to become another victim of their manipulation. Tomorrow, I would have to decide how far I was willing to go to hold them accountable for what they'd done to both me and Grandma Elena. But tonight, I mourned for the grandmother who'd been abused by her own family and for the naive trust I'd placed in people who'd never deserved it. Part 5. The direct confrontation. The decision to confront my family directly came after a sleepless night of weighing my options. Sarah Thompson had advised me to avoid contact with them until the criminal investigation was complete, but I needed answers that only they could provide. I needed to understand how they'd justified their actions to themselves, and I needed to see their faces when I revealed what I'd discovered about their crimes. More importantly, I needed them to understand that I knew exactly what they'd done. I decided to attend Sunday dinner at my parents' house, the weekly ritual that had been a cornerstone of our family life for as long as I could remember. It was the one place where all the key players would be present, and the familiar setting might make them more likely to speak honestly about their actions. I would go armed with copies of the evidence I'd gathered, and I would document everything for the investigation. Before leaving my apartment, I set up a small recording device in my purse. Sarah had explained that Arizona was a single-party consent state, meaning I could legally record conversations as long as I was a participant. The recordings could be used as evidence in both criminal and civil proceedings, providing documentation of any admissions or threats that might occur during the confrontation. The drive to my parents' house in Tempe felt like traveling to a foreign country. The familiar streets and landmarks looked the same, but everything felt different now that I understood the true nature of the people I was going to see. The modest, ranch-style house where I'd grown up no longer represented safety and family love. It represented the headquarters of a conspiracy designed to steal my inheritance. I arrived at exactly 5 o'clock, the time Sunday dinner had started for as long as I could remember. Dad's truck was in the driveway next to Mom's sedan, and I could see Jessica's car parked on the street. Through the front window, I could see the dining room table set with Mom's good china, the same dishes we'd used for special occasions throughout my childhood. Everything looked normal and welcoming, like a scene from a family magazine. Mom answered the door with a bright smile and a hug that felt like a performance. "Maya, sweetheart, I'm so glad you decided to come. We've missed you these past few weeks." Her voice carried the forced cheerfulness she used when she was trying to manipulate a situation. The same tone she'd used when I was a child, and she wanted me to do something I didn't want to do. Inside, the house smelled like pot roast and garlic mashed potatoes, familiar scents that should have been comforting, but instead felt like weapons deployed to evoke nostalgia and family loyalty. Dad was sitting in his usual chair in the living room, reading the newspaper and pretending to be absorbed in the sports section. Jessica was helping Mom in the kitchen, moving around the familiar space with the ease of someone who'd never really left home despite being 25 years old. "Maya's here," Mom announced, and Jessica came out of the kitchen with a smile. That looked genuinely relieved. She hugged me tightly, whispering, "Thank you for coming," in my ear like she'd been afraid I might never speak to any of them again. The irony was that she was probably right to be afraid, though not for the reasons she imagined. We gathered around the dining room table that had been the scene of countless family meals, holiday celebrations, and important conversations throughout my life. The ritual was exactly the same as always. Dad carved the roast, Mom served the vegetables, Jessica chattered about whatever was currently happening in her life. For a few minutes, I could almost pretend that nothing had changed, that we were still a normal family sharing a normal meal. But then, Dad started asking questions that revealed the true purpose of the gathering. "Maya, have you given any more thought to Jessica's situation?" he asked, his tone carefully casual as he cut his meat into precise pieces. "I know it's a big decision, but family emergencies sometimes require quick action." I took a bite of pot roast and chewed slowly, buying myself time to formulate a response. "Actually, I've been doing some research of my own into the situation," I said finally. "I wanted to understand all the details before making such an important decision." Dad looked up from his plate, his expression suddenly more alert. "What kind of research?" "Well, I've been learning about investment scams and how they work," I said, watching his face carefully. "And I've been researching loan options and credit alternatives, trying to understand what solutions might be available." There was a moment of silence around the table, and I could feel the tension level rising. Mom's smile became more strained. Jessica looked nervous, and Dad's jaw tightened in a way that meant he was trying to control his temper. "That's very thoughtful of you, sweetheart," Mom said, her voice still artificially bright. "I'm sure your research will help you understand why this is such an important opportunity to help family." "Oh, it's definitely helped me understand things," I agreed. "For instance, I learned that someone has been applying for loans in my name using my personal information and my inheritance as collateral." The silence that followed was deafening. Dad's fork stopped halfway to his mouth. Mom's face went pale. Jessica looked like she was about to be sick. "What do you mean?" Dad asked, his voice carefully controlled. I reached into my purse and pulled out a folder containing copies of the fraudulent loan applications and bank investigation documents. I spread them across the dining room table like evidence in a courtroom, watching my family's faces as they recognized the scope of what I'd discovered. I mean that someone has been systematically contacting financial institutions, claiming to be me or claiming to represent me, and attempting to secure loans using my inheritance as collateral, I said, my voice remaining calm and steady. The bank's fraud investigation has documented multiple attempted crimes, all committed by someone with intimate knowledge of my personal and financial information. Dad leaned forward to examine the documents, and I watched his face as he realized how much evidence had been gathered against him. His skin took on a grayish pallor, and his hands were slightly shaky as he picked up one of the loan applications. "Maya, I can explain," he said, his voice no longer controlled. "Please do," I said. "I'd love to hear your explanation for committing identity theft and fraud against your own daughter." "It wasn't supposed to be fraud," he said, his words coming out in a rush. "I was just researching options, trying to understand what might be available if you decided to help Jessica. I never actually intended to follow through with any applications without your permission." But you did follow through, I said, pulling out additional documents. You submitted completed applications with forged signatures. You provided detailed personal information that only family members would know. You used my social security number and employment information to deceive financial institutions. Mom finally found her voice. Maya, honey, we never meant to hurt you. We were just trying to find solutions to help Jessica. And we thought maybe, if we could show you that options were available, you might be more willing to help. By committing crimes in my name? I asked, my voice rising slightly. By stealing my identity and forging my signature? Mom, what you're describing is a felony. Multiple felonies, actually. Jessica had been silent throughout this exchange, but now she spoke up with tears in her eyes. Maya, I told you I didn't know the details of what Dad was doing. I thought he was just researching possibilities, not actually applying for things. I turned to look at her directly. Jessica, you knew enough to understand that Dad was using my information without my permission. You knew enough to feel guilty about it, which is why you didn't ask for details. You can't claim ignorance when you chose not to investigate something you suspected was wrong. The conversation continued for over an hour, with my family cycling through denial, minimization, justification, and desperate attempts to make me understand their perspective. Dad insisted that he'd been trying to help the family, and that his actions hadn't been intended to harm me. Mom claimed that they'd only been exploring options, and that they'd never planned to actually steal from me. Jessica maintained that she'd been a victim of the investment scam and deserved compassion rather than judgment. But none of their explanations could change the fundamental facts. They had committed crimes against me. They had violated my trust and my privacy. They had treated my inheritance like family property to be exploited, rather than my personal gift to be respected. The most revealing moment came when I showed them copies of Grandma Elena's notes from her house, documenting their years of financial pressure and manipulation. She knew, I said, watching their faces as they read her careful documentation of their behavior. Grandma Elena knew exactly what kind of people you were, and that's why she left everything to me instead of dividing it among family members. Dad's face flushed red with anger. Your grandmother was a stubborn old woman who didn't understand family responsibility, he said, his voice becoming harsh. That money should have been divided equally among her children and grandchildren, not hoarded by one person who's too selfish to share it. Selfish? I repeated, incredulous. Dad, it's my inheritance. It was left specifically to me by someone who spent years documenting your attempts to manipulate and pressure her for money. And instead of respecting her wishes, you decided to steal it. We weren't stealing, Mom insisted. We were just trying to access family money to solve a family problem. That's what families do. They share resources and help each other. No, Mom, I said, standing up from the table. What families do is respect each other's property and autonomy. What families do is support each other without committing crimes. What you did was target a vulnerable family member for financial exploitation, just like you did with Grandma Elena. The dinner ended with raised voices and accusations, exactly as I'd expected it would. But I'd gotten what I came for: recorded admissions of their crimes, documentation of their attitudes about family money and property rights, and a clear understanding of how they'd justified their actions to themselves. As I prepared to leave, Dad made one final attempt to manipulate the situation. Maya, if you pursue this investigation, you'll destroy our family, he said, his voice taking on the tone he'd used when I was a child, and he wanted to make me feel guilty for disappointing him. Is your inheritance really worth losing your parents and your sister? I looked at him for a long moment. This man who'd raised me and taught me about right and wrong, who'd been a hero to me throughout my childhood and was now revealed as someone willing to steal from his own children. Dad, I said quietly, you destroyed our family the moment you decided to commit crimes against me. I didn't make that choice. You did. The drive home was a blur of Phoenix traffic and conflicting emotions. I felt vindicated by my family's admissions, but also heartbroken by the confirmation that they really had conspired to steal from me. The people who were supposed to love and protect me had instead treated me like a target for exploitation. And they still didn't seem to understand why their actions were wrong. That night, I called Detective Rodriguez to provide her with copies of the recordings and to update her on what I'd learned during the confrontation. She was particularly interested in Dad's admission that he'd submitted completed loan applications, viewing it as crucial evidence for the criminal prosecution. Ms. Chen, what you've gathered tonight is exactly the kind of evidence we need to build a strong case, she said. Your father's admissions, combined with the documentary evidence we've already collected, should be sufficient to support multiple felony charges. She also warned me that my family's reaction to being confronted suggested they might become more desperate and potentially more dangerous as the investigation progressed. The threats Dad had made about destroying the family if I pursued legal action were concerning, as they suggested he might be willing to escalate his criminal behavior rather than accept responsibility for what he'd done. I recommend that you maintain minimal contact with your family from this point forward, Detective Rodriguez continued. If they contact you, document everything, but don't engage in extended conversations that could give them opportunities to threaten or manipulate you further. As I prepared for bed that night, I realized that the confrontation had marked a point of no return in my relationship with my family. There would be no going back to the way things were before, no possibility of pretending that their crimes hadn't happened. I'd crossed a line by exposing their behavior, and they'd crossed a line by committing those behaviors in the first place. Tomorrow, I would have to begin the process of moving forward with my life, knowing that the people who'd been my family were now my adversaries in a criminal investigation. But tonight, I felt a strange sense of relief at finally understanding the truth about the people I'd trusted most in the world. The weeks following my confrontation with my family passed in a strange blur of legal meetings, police interviews, and the surreal process of watching my own relatives being investigated. For crimes against me, Phoenix's relentless summer heat had arrived early, turning the city into a furnace that seemed to mirror the intensity of everything happening in my life. I found myself spending more time indoors, working from my air-conditioned apartment while the legal machinery slowly ground forward toward what everyone assured me would be justice. Detective Rodriguez called me on a Tuesday morning in late June with news that made my coffee cup freeze halfway to my lips. Ms. Chen, we've completed our investigation, and the district attorney's office has decided to move forward with criminal charges against your father and mother. Your sister Jessica has agreed to cooperate with the prosecution in exchange for reduced charges. The words should have felt like victory, but instead they felt like the final collapse of something I'd been hoping might somehow be salvaged. My parents would face felony charges for identity theft, fraud, and elder financial abuse. Jessica would plead guilty to conspiracy and receive probation in exchange for testifying against our parents. The family I'd grown up with was being systematically dismantled by the legal system, one criminal charge at a time. What happens next? I asked, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears. There will be arraignments, plea negotiations, possibly a trial if your parents don't accept plea deals, Detective Rodriguez explained. The process could take months, maybe longer, and Ms. Chen, you need to be prepared for the possibility that your parents might try to contact you or pressure you to drop the charges. They might not understand that criminal charges can't be dropped by the victim once they've been filed. She was right to warn me. That afternoon, I received the first of what would become a series of increasingly desperate phone calls from my mother. Her voice was shaky and tearful, cycling between pleading and anger in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of Jessica's manipulation tactics. Maya, you have to understand. We never meant for things to go this far, Mom said, her words tumbling over each other in her urgency to make me understand. The lawyers are saying your father could go to prison for years. Prison, Maya. Is that really what you want for your own father? I listened to her pain and felt something I hadn't expected: pity. Not the kind of pity that would make me change my mind about the prosecution, but genuine sadness for a woman who'd made such catastrophically poor choices that she'd destroyed her own family. She sounded genuinely shocked that actions had consequences, as if she'd believed that family loyalty would somehow protect them from legal accountability. "Mom, I didn't choose for Dad to go to prison," I said quietly. "Dad chose that when he decided to commit felonies against me. I didn't file criminal charges. The district attorney did that based on the evidence of crimes that Dad committed. But you could ask them to drop the charges," she insisted. "You could tell them you forgive us and you don't want us prosecuted. Families work these things out privately, Maya. We don't send each other to prison over misunderstandings." The word misunderstandings hit me like a slap. Even now, facing criminal prosecution, she was still minimizing what they'd done. Identity theft and financial fraud weren't misunderstandings. They were deliberate crimes that had required planning and coordination. The refusal to accept responsibility was as infuriating as the original crimes had been. "Mom, this wasn't a misunderstanding," I said, my voice becoming firmer. "This was a systematic effort to steal my inheritance through identity theft and fraud. You documented your own crimes with bank applications and phone calls. There's no misunderstanding about what happened." The conversation ended with Mom hanging up on me, but it wouldn't be the last one. Over the following weeks, I received calls and texts from extended family members who'd been enlisted to pressure me into asking for mercy for my parents. Aunts and uncles who barely knew the details of the case called to lecture me about family loyalty and forgiveness. Cousins sent guilt-inducing messages about how my actions were destroying the family reputation. The family pressure campaign was coordinated and relentless, designed to make me feel like the villain in a story where I was actually the victim. It was a masterclass in emotional manipulation, using every relationship and shared memory to try to convince me that protecting myself from criminals was somehow morally wrong because those criminals happened to be related to me. But the pressure campaign had an unexpected effect. It clarified for me just how dysfunctional my family's understanding of loyalty and responsibility really was. The same relatives who were now demanding that I show mercy to people who'd committed crimes against me had never once called to express concern for my welfare or to acknowledge that I'd been victimized. Their version of family loyalty was entirely one-directional, expecting victims to protect their abusers while offering nothing in return. I changed my phone number and blocked most of my extended family on social media. Sarah Thompson helped me draft a letter explaining that I wouldn't be discussing the criminal case with family members and that any further attempts to pressure me about the prosecution would be documented and potentially used as evidence of witness intimidation. The letter had the desired effect of reducing the direct pressure, but it also marked my complete separation from my extended family. People who'd been part of my life since childhood suddenly viewed me as a traitor rather than a victim, choosing to side with the criminals rather than the person they'd victimized. It was a harsh lesson in how family loyalty often protects abusers at the expense of their victims. As summer progressed, I found myself rebuilding my life in ways I'd never anticipated. The inheritance money, now safely secured in accounts my family couldn't access, allowed me to make changes I'd never thought possible. I quit my marketing job and enrolled in a graduate program in forensic accounting, inspired by my experience with financial crime investigation. I moved to a new apartment in a different part of Phoenix, creating physical distance between myself and the memories associated with my family. Most importantly, I started therapy with a counselor who specialized in family trauma and financial abuse. Dr. Maria Santos helped me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't just criminal behavior. It was a form of familial abuse that was more common than most people realized. She helped me process the grief of losing my family not through death, but through the discovery of who they really were. Financial abuse within families often involves this kind of systematic devaluation of the victim's autonomy, Dr. Santos explained during one of our sessions. Your family didn't see you as an individual with rights to your own property and privacy. They saw you as a resource to be managed for the benefit of the family unit, with them determining what that benefit should be. The therapy helped me understand that my family's crimes weren't aberrations or desperate mistakes. They were the logical extension of a family system that had never truly respected my independence or autonomy. The same dynamics that had led them to pressure Grandma Elena for money had led them to steal from me, and they would have continued finding new victims to exploit if they hadn't been stopped. In August, Dad's attorney contacted Sarah Thompson to discuss a possible plea agreement. Dad was willing to plead guilty to reduce charges in exchange for avoiding a trial that would expose all the details of his crimes in public court records. The offer included restitution for my legal expenses and a formal apology, though it notably didn't include any acknowledgement that his actions had been morally wrong rather than simply legally problematic. Sarah and I discussed the plea offer extensively. From a legal standpoint, it would save me the stress and expense of a trial while still ensuring that Dad faced meaningful consequences for his crimes. From a personal standpoint, it would allow me to move forward with my life without having to relive the details of my family's betrayal in a public courtroom. "The decision is entirely yours," Sarah said. "But I think it's worth considering that a plea agreement gives you more control over the resolution than a trial would. Trials can be unpredictable, and there's always a risk that a jury might be swayed by sympathy for your parents rather than focusing on the facts of their crimes." I ultimately agreed to the plea agreement, not because I felt sorry for my parents, but because I wanted to close this chapter of my life and move forward. Dad pleaded guilty to felony identity theft and fraud, receiving 3 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and an order to pay full restitution for my legal expenses. Mom pleaded guilty to conspiracy charges and received similar terms. Jessica's cooperation earned her a more lenient sentence of probation and community service. The day of Dad's sentencing was surreal in its ordinariness. We sat in a generic courtroom with fluorescent lighting and institutional carpeting, while a judge in black robes formally recorded the end of my family as I'd known it. Dad looked older and smaller than I remembered, wearing a suit that seemed too big for him and speaking in a voice barely above a whisper when he acknowledged his guilt. When the judge asked if he had anything to say before sentencing, Dad turned to look at me for the first time since the proceedings had begun. "I'm sorry, Maya," he said. And for a moment, I thought he might actually understand what he'd done wrong. But then he continued, "I'm sorry that trying to help our family led to all this trouble." Even in his moment of legal accountability, he couldn't bring himself to acknowledge that his actions had been wrong rather than simply unsuccessful. He was sorry about the consequences, but not about the crimes. He was sorry that he'd been caught, but not that he'd betrayed his own daughter's trust. I didn't respond to his apology because there was nothing to say. Words that don't acknowledge wrongdoing aren't really apologies. They're just expressions of regret about outcomes. And I wasn't interested in helping him feel better about the choices he'd made. After the sentencing, I walked out of the courthouse into the blazing Phoenix afternoon and felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Freedom. Not the freedom that comes from winning a victory, but the freedom that comes from finally accepting reality and moving forward without the weight of false hope. That evening, I drove to Grandma Elena's house in Flagstaff for the first time since discovering my family's crimes. I'd been avoiding the property because it reminded me of everything I'd lost, but now I wanted to see it through different eyes. This wasn't just the house where my grandmother had lived. It was the tangible representation of her decision to protect her life's work from people who would have exploited it. I spent the weekend cleaning and organizing the house, preparing it to be sold. Not because I needed the money, but because I wanted to honor Grandma Elena's memory by using her gift responsibly rather than hoarding it sentimentally. The house deserved to be lived in by people who would appreciate it, just as the inheritance money deserved to be used purposefully rather than simply accumulated. As I packed away Grandma Elena's belongings, I found a small wooden box in her bedroom dresser that I'd missed during my previous search. Inside was a collection of photographs spanning decades of her life, from her arrival in America as a young woman to family gatherings from recent years. But tucked beneath the photographs was a letter addressed to me in her careful handwriting. "My dear Maya," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have discovered the inheritance I left for you. I hope you understand that this was not an arbitrary decision, but a careful choice based on years of observation and consideration." The letter went on to explain her reasoning in more detail than the will had provided. She'd observed my character throughout my childhood and young adulthood, noting my respect for other people's property, my financial responsibility, and my genuine interest in family relationships rather than family resources. She'd also observed the character of other family members, documenting their attempts to pressure her for money and their attitudes toward her autonomy. "I chose you not because you are perfect, but because you understand that love and money are separate things," she wrote. "You visited me because you enjoyed my company, not because you wanted something from me. You helped me with practical matters because you cared about my welfare, not because you were hoping to inherit my possessions." The letter concluded with advice that felt prophetic, given everything that had happened. "I suspect that some family members will not understand or accept my decision. They may try to pressure you to share the inheritance or to use it in ways that they think are appropriate. Remember that this is your gift to use as you see fit. Do not let anyone else's sense of entitlement override your own judgment about what is right." Reading Grandma Elena's final words to me, I understood that she'd anticipated my family's reaction to the inheritance. She'd known that they would try to pressure me, manipulate me, or potentially even try to take the money without my consent. She'd tried to prepare me for their behavior while also trusting me to handle it appropriately. I kept the letter and donated most of Grandma Elena's other possessions to local charities, keeping only a few items that held special memories. The house sold quickly to a young family with children who were excited about the mature trees and the quiet neighborhood. I felt good about seeing the property go to people who would appreciate it for the right reasons. With the legal proceedings concluded and the house sold, I found myself facing a question I'd been avoiding. What did I want to do with the rest of my life? The inheritance had given me financial freedom, but it had also forced me to confront fundamental questions about family, loyalty, and trust that I'd never had to consider before. I decided to use part of the money to establish a scholarship fund for students studying financial crime investigation and elder abuse prevention. It felt like a fitting tribute to Grandma Elena's memory and a way to turn my negative experience into something that might help protect other people from similar crimes. The scholarship would be awarded annually to students who demonstrated both academic excellence and genuine commitment to protecting vulnerable populations from financial exploitation. I also used some of the inheritance to buy a small house in Scottsdale, creating a space that was entirely my own and had no associations with my family history. The house had a guest room that I turned into a home office where I could pursue my forensic accounting studies, and a backyard with enough space for a garden where I could grow vegetables and herbs like Grandma Elena had taught me. But perhaps most importantly, I began building new relationships based on honesty and mutual respect rather than family obligation and shared history. I joined professional organizations related to my new field of study, volunteered with organizations that helped elderly people protect themselves from financial scams, and gradually developed friendships with people who knew nothing about my family drama but valued me for who I was rather than what I could provide. The process of rebuilding. My life wasn't always easy. There were days when I missed the family I'd thought I had, when I grieved for the relationships that could have been if my parents and sister had been different people. There were moments when I wondered if I'd been too harsh, too unforgiving, too willing to choose legal justice over family harmony. But those doubts always faded when I remembered the evidence of their crimes, the systematic nature of their betrayal, and their continued refusal to accept responsibility for their actions. I hadn't destroyed my family. I had simply refused to enable people who were willing to destroy me for their own benefit. 2 years after Grandma Elena's death, I graduated from my forensic accounting program and accepted a position with a firm that specialized in investigating financial crimes against elderly victims. The work was challenging and often heartbreaking, but it felt meaningful in a way that my previous marketing job never had. Every case I worked on was an opportunity to prevent someone else from experiencing the kind of betrayal I'd suffered, or to help victims recover from crimes that had already been committed. On the anniversary of Grandma Elena's death, I visited her grave in the small cemetery outside Flagstaff, where she'd chosen to be buried. I brought flowers from my garden and sat in the desert sunshine, telling her about the scholarship fund, my new career, and the life I'd built with her gift. I thanked her for her wisdom in recognizing my family's true nature and for trusting me with the responsibility of using her life's work purposefully. As I prepared to leave the cemetery, I realized that I no longer felt angry about what my family had done to me. The anger had been replaced by something more complex: sadness for the people they could have been, gratitude for the lessons I'd learned, and determination to use my experience to help others avoid similar betrayals. I never heard from my parents or Jessica again after the sentencing. The last I knew, they were living in the same house in Tempe, dealing with the financial and social consequences of their criminal convictions. Extended family members occasionally reached out through mutual acquaintances, usually to suggest that enough time had passed for reconciliation, but I politely declined those overtures. Some bridges, once burned, can't be rebuilt, and some bridges shouldn't be rebuilt. My new life wasn't perfect, but it was authentic in a way my old life had never been. I was surrounded by people who respected my boundaries, supported my goals, and valued my well-being rather than viewing me as a resource to be exploited. I had work that mattered, relationships based on mutual respect, and the security that came from understanding my own worth independent of family approval. Sometimes people asked me if I regretted pursuing criminal charges against my family, if I thought the price of justice had been too high. The question always surprised me because it suggested that maintaining relationships with people who'd committed crimes against me would somehow have been healthier than holding them accountable for their actions. The truth was that I didn't lose my family when I reported their crimes. I discovered that I'd never had the family I thought I had. The people who raised me were willing to steal from me when it served their interests, and the people who claimed to love me were willing to exploit my trust for their benefit. Learning those truths was painful, but it was also liberating in ways I couldn't have anticipated. I built a life based on honesty rather than obligation, respect rather than manipulation, and genuine affection rather than familial duty. And while that life looked very different from what I'd once imagined it would be, it was unquestionably better than the alternative of remaining connected to people who viewed me as a means to their ends rather than a person deserving of love and respect. Grandma Elena had been right about many things, but she'd been especially right about the importance of understanding that love and money are separate things. Real love doesn't come with conditions or expectations of financial benefit. Real family doesn't require you to sacrifice your well-being for other people's comfort. And real loyalty doesn't ask you to enable criminal behavior or accept abuse in the name of keeping the peace. The inheritance had given me more than financial security. It had given me the opportunity to discover who I really was when I wasn't trying to meet other people's expectations or manage other people's emotions. And that person, it turned out, was someone I actually liked and respected. Someone who deserved better than what my original family had been willing to offer. As I drove back to Phoenix from the cemetery, watching the desert landscape shift from high country pines to saguaro cacti, I felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you've honored both yourself and someone who believed in you. Grandma Elena's gift had been more than money. It had been an investment in my future and a vote of confidence in my character. And I had proven worthy of that investment by choosing truth over convenience, justice over false peace, and self-respect over family approval. The road ahead stretched into the desert heat. Full of possibilities, I was finally free to explore without the weight of other people's expectations or the fear of other people's betrayals. It was exactly where I belonged. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.